Bona nit i benvinguts a EYECatalunya, la plataforma per la promoció internacional dels creadors catalans. Em dic Patricia Caicedo i aquesta nit estaré amb vostès en el viatge de descobriment dels creadors més innovadors que viuen a Catalunya. Aquest programa és possible gràcies al patrocini del Departament de Cultura de la Generalitat de Catalunya i del Servei de Diplomàcia Pública de Catalunya, Diplocat. També gràcies a la col·laboració del Recinte Modernista de Sant Pau, el preciós lloc on estem aquesta nit. Benvinguts a tots, persones, seguidors al món i aquí a la sala. Welcome to all our followers around the world. Thank you for following us, for being part of EYECatalunya. I would like to remind you that you can hear a translation and there is a window in the streaming window of the website. There are two little windows, one for the mainstream, and on the right side of your screen you will find a small window in which it says translation. Tonight the program will be entirely in English, so la traducció serà per les persones que estan escoltant, que voleu escoltar el programa en català o en castellà. Si voleu escoltar el programa en català o en castellà, aquesta nit podeu utilitzar la finestra de traducció. Aquesta nit tenim un programa molt interessant i molt divers. Tenim tres convidats, com sempre, molt interessants, però no solament farem un viatge de descobriment per als creadors més innovadors a Catalunya, però també farem un viatge en el temps. Per què? Perquè començarem amb l'edat mitjana, continuarem amb el segle XXI en recerca del cervell i després tornarem al segle XVIII per aprendre com se parlava i qui parlava l'inglès a Catalunya. Començarem aquesta nit amb un convidat, un medievalista que ha nascut, un català que ha nascut a Alemanya i que ha estudiat filosofia i s'ha decantat per l'estudi. Una de les coses que ha estudiat és el nostre teòleg i pensador Ramon Llull. Benvingut, Alexander Fidora.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to EYECatalunya. I'm pleased to be here. As Patricia said, in a certain way, I am a newcomer to Catalonia since I was born and grew up in Germany, received my academic training at the University of Frankfurt, where I also taught for some years before joining the Institució Catalana de Recerca i Estudis Avançats and the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. On the other hand, and also this Patricia mentioned, I could also be described rather than as a newcomer, as a homecomer, since my mother is from Catalonia, so that we always had strong family ties with Catalonia and the Catalan territories. Even though I have to confess that at home we didn't speak any Catalan, or not very much Catalan. Only in very precarious, very difficult moments when my brother or I behaved in a very nasty manner, then my mother would switch to her native tongue, to her real mother tongue, and would shout at us in Catalan. So the first contact with Catalan language was not a very positive one, as you can imagine, però he superat el trauma. Anyhow, whether old or new Catalan, my research and my research projects, as well as my life, are now based since 2006 in Catalonia. And today I would give you some ideas or some insights into what these research projects are about. In very general terms, I'm doing research in the field of medieval studies, and particularly, more particularly, I'm looking into the transmission of both philosophical and theological knowledge during the Middle Ages between Jews, Christian, and Muslims. This sounds very vague at a first glance, so let me give you a more precise example of what we are doing. Since October of last year, we are doing research in a research project that is funded by the European Research Council on the Latin Talmud and its influence on Jewish-Christian polemic during the Middle Ages. The Latin Talmud, or the project itself, is about the discovery, one has to say, and the use of the Talmud, which is the biggest post-biblical Jewish corpus. So it's rabbinic teachings after the Bible that are collected and which regulate every aspect of daily Jewish life. This has been translated into Latin in the 13th century under very strange circumstances. First, in 1239, a Jewish convert, Nicolas Donin, addressed Pope Gregory with a collection of passages that he translated from the Talmud and which he considered offensive with regard to Christian religion, and in particular with regard to Jesus, who is said to be burning in excrements in hell, or to the Virgin Mary, for which they have nasty names in there, as Nicolas Donin tells us. The Pope reacts immediately, because the Church can be speedy under certain circumstances, and writes to the kings all over Europe to tell them to confiscate the Talmud and to examine the Talmud. In French, this leads in 1240 to a trial against the Talmud, and in 1241, the Talmud is publicly burned at the Place de la Grève in Paris, in the center, in the heart of Paris. This was, however, not the end of the Talmud affair during the Middle Ages, because, curiously enough, after condemning and then burning the Talmud, the Christian authorities decided that it might be useful to translate the Talmud and to see what they actually condemned and burned. This came a bit late, but even so, in 1244, they translated large portions of the Talmud. 1,800 passages actually were translated into Latin by Christian theologians of that time, which mark a turning point in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, since they show that Christians became aware of something that is even today many times forgotten in Jewish-Christian encounters, namely the fact that just in a very similar way as for the Christians, the Old Testament is completed by the New Testament, so also the Jews do not only rely on the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, but this is supplemented by and complemented by the Talmud. This is an important insight which even today is often forgotten in Christian approaches towards Judaism. So what we do, in essence, is to edit this important corpus and to make it accessible for readers. We will also translate it, so to see what happened in the mid of the 13th century. This is, I think, an important contribution not only to preserving cultural heritage in general terms, but actually it is also a step, maybe only one step, but a step towards doing justice to past generations and preparing ourselves for the present and the future. In the sense that with this edition that we are preparing and translation, we raise awareness of and we try to come to terms with a very difficult chapter in European history, that is minority policies in the Middle Ages. This is one out of several research lines that I'm pursuing, and I guess that in our discussion we can also touch upon others, just like Ramon Llull, who is celebrating, or we are celebrating this year, his 700th, not anniversary, but the 7th centenary of his death, which will give way to many acts and celebrations in Barcelona. But I think that with this brief presentation, I have already given you some insight and some idea of what we are doing at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona.
Thank you, Alexander. Come here so we talk. So I wonder, this is really fascinating. How many people are involved in this research?
We have right now 2 postdocs at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. We will incorporate another 2 doctoral students, and we work closely together with people in Israel and in Germany who join us for longer periods at the Autònoma.
And how do you find, because you were saying there were passages that were censored in a way, how did you identify or find those passages that were censored? Where are they, or where?
Now, what is particularly interesting about the Latin Talmud is that precisely this Latin version preserves many of the passages that were later censored.
Oh.
Because they translated, of course, all the passages which they thought were particularly controversial and particularly offensive. And once they had translated them, the Christian censors could operate, and in manuscripts, but also in later editions of the Talmud, these passages were usually eliminated. So through the Latin Talmud translation, we have access to a layer of the original text, which in many editions, original Hebrew and Aramaic editions, is lost because of censorship.
And you are translating this or putting this into what language now?
We have, first of all, maybe I should have explained this before for those who are not so familiar with philological work and what critical editions are. Texts in the Middle Ages were extremely unstable because there was no printing, which means that texts were transmitted by copies, handwritten copies. And with every handwritten copy, the quality of what was transmitted went down. I mean, everybody knows this children game where you tell your neighbor something in a very low voice, and at the end, the result has very little to do with what the input was. The same happens in some cases with transmission in the Middle Ages. So our work is to gather the manuscripts. There are 10 at the moment. One is from Girona. And to compare word for word what they have, because sometimes there can be a knot which has been dropped and then the sense changes completely. Prepare an edition which gathers all these differences, that would be the critical edition, and establish the critical text. And then we want to prepare a translation to make this work accessible also for those who are not familiar with Latin.
So into English?
Into English,
Into English, interesting. And you mentioned something about making justice with.
Yeah.
Explain a little bit more about
Well, I think that in general, cultural heritage and preservation of cultural heritage has a lot to do with doing justice to past generations, for instance. But in this particular case, I think that it stands out to everybody that this is the case. We are not just preserving cultural heritage for the sake of this cultural heritage, but because this has been part of a very dark chapter of European history in the Middle Ages, but which still has lots of relevance to our daily lives, in the sense that minority policies are still an important issue. And if you look at the way that the Talmud trial went, you see that many things went wrong. I told you, they condemned it, they burned it, and then they started examining it. So it's a strange sequence of events.
And when I was reading about you and when I found you, I was fascinated for what you do, because I thought it's very contemporary. I mean, it's very something that talks what you do, interreligious relationships, is something very contemporary. I mean, now that we are witnessing Islamophobia, with problems also against Jewish people, what do you think about it?
It is. I mean, you have to find the right balance. Of course, you cannot make an easy transfer and say that all these problems were already there and still persist in the same way, and that we have to go back to medieval sources to solve these problems. This would be, I think everybody agrees, a much too easy solution. But there is certain patterns and there is certain problems which have not been solved since then. As I said before, in Christian, even nowadays, in Christian approaches from Rome and other official authorities, one of the problems that Jews feel is that their exegetical tradition, the way that they read the texts, is not taken into consideration enough, because, for instance, the Talmud, which develops a lot of this exegesis, is not really taken into consideration by their interlocutors, because they do not acknowledge the status of this text as a semi-sacred text for the Jews.
But very interesting. Now, having you here, we have to talk about Ramon Llull.
Of course.
Especially because it connects you with Catalunya and also with this interreligious thing. Something that fascinates me about Ramon Llull is the fact that he did a real effort to understand other religions, even his idea was to convert them, but he really tried to make a rational effort to develop a methodology also.
Yeah, that's true. He is one of the few thinkers during the Middle Ages who not only wrote about mission and conversion, but who put it into practice, and who were willing to put their own lives into danger in order to stand up for their ideas. So he traveled to Africa, he traveled to Béjaïa, he traveled to Tunisia.
And he learned the languages.
He learned
Arabic.
the languages, of course. He learned the languages,
also.
and he told everybody that he wanted to have a dialogue which was purely rational. He insisted on that. Neither Bible, nor Talmud, nor Quran, purely rational, he said. We just take those concepts, which are in the end philosophical concepts that are common to all religions. For instance, goodness, greatness, eternity. And we speak about these concepts. And we do it in a rational manner, without any reference to revealed texts and traditions. And he said, if we discuss these concepts, I'm willing, if you can convince me that these concepts fit better into an Islamic account of the world, I'm willing to convert. So he claimed, whether he would have done is another question, but he claimed that rationality, and that's important, I think, also nowadays, rationality requires reciprocity. You cannot tell somebody you have to accept the best argument, but not be willing to revise your own view in the light of the best argument. And that's something that Llull insisted very much upon. Rationality means reciprocity. You have to put, it's not only the other's identity that is at stake, but it's also your identity, and you have to be willing to accept
if you are persuaded by the other,
even if it's in detriment of your own convictions.
This is very important. Should be applied nowadays.
This is an important insight. But it's an insight which is very difficult, I think, to really carry out. It's easy as an ideology or as a conviction to be uttered at the beginning of religious dialogue, but then really to go into such a dialogue with this openness of saying, well, if they convince me, then I will change my essence. Or I will exchange my essence. EYECatalunya. No?
Yes, but this is really very nice, because he was also not only developing this rational approach, but also he made a very conscious effort to get to know others before he started this process. So he, as I was saying, he learned Arabic. He wrote in Arabic. He wrote in Latin. He wrote in Catalan, of course.
Yeah, he was. This is also something which is rather unfrequent in medieval times and even nowadays, that you think of your public, you think of your audience, and he chose languages according to the public that he was targeting. And he wrote for different publics, not only for different religious publics, as you said, for which he would use Arabic on the one hand and Latin on the other. Hebrew he did not know, but he also wrote for children. And he wrote for women who by that time were in a desperately asymmetrical situation with regard to education. Women had no access to education in Latin. And so he wrote in Catalan for children, he wrote in Catalan for women, he wrote in Catalan also for a man audience, but he was very well aware of the fact that you have to get to your audience through language.
To adjust to them in a way.
Yeah.
get to their level, because he was not writing in Latin or for the elites.
Yeah, exactly.
I have questions from people now. There's a question that says, where did your interest in studying the Talmud came from? Oh.
Because I cannot say that I really had a material interest in the Talmud as such. I'm not a Talmudist, which is a field of expertise which requires lots of training. I'm interested in these phenomena of transmission of knowledge in the Middle Ages, and to see how texts and ideas travel from one religious but also linguistic community to another, and how these transmission, or how these texts then develop their own dynamics. And in the case of the Latin Talmud, one of the dynamics, or one of the consequences it has, is that it is actually the beginning of Christian Hebraism. That's the moment when Christians, for the first time, after many years or centuries, get again interested in Hebrew source texts, which also help them, and this is quite clear in Protestant theology until our days, which help them to redefine their own identity as Christians.
And I have another question. How do you think technology can help you to preserve all this heritage?
There's many projects, many ongoing projects, for instance, for digitizing manuscripts. You have to think that most of this medieval cultural heritage is preserved in manuscripts, which have been in libraries for centuries, but the quality of which, of course, does not get better, on the contrary. And so there have been important initiatives over the last years, decades, to digitize these texts so that even if they deteriorate, we will have these digital images that allow us both to preserve them, but also, and this is an important factor as well, to work on this text on a more international level. I will give you an example from Ramon Llull, since you asked before. At Freiburg, there is the Raimundus Lullus Institute of the University of Freiburg, where they prepare, or they enhance the edition of his Latin works. Years ago, you had to go there and work there with microfilms. Now they have digitized everything. So you have researchers in Brazil who sit at home or in the university.
Yeah.
You have researchers in Italy. You have researchers all over the place who work on these editions without having to travel.
And this makes the dream of Ramon Llull.
This makes because he traveled a lot, and actually his last trip costed him his life. So maybe he would have preferred to do some of his work, not all, because he wanted personal contact through internet.
And there is another question from somebody that says, how do you think technology? And I think we are done with the questions from people, because also we are done with the time. But it had been very interesting, and we could be talking longer, but we will continue at the end.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander. La propera convidada és una dona que ha estudiat la carrera d'Economia, però que ha dedicat gran part de la seva carrera a la promoció de la ciència, de les ciències bàsiques. I ella crec que la ciència pot convertir-se en un model de negoci. I és la cofundadora d'una empresa internacional molt important que es diu Starlab, i també la cofundadora, la CEO right now, de Neuroelectrics. Benvinguda, Anna Maiques.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation. Patricia, it's an honor to be here. I am an entrepreneur, a very proud entrepreneur in Barcelona. And I'm often said that my team and we are entrepreneurs for the brain age. And I'm going to talk a bit about entrepreneurship and a lot about the brain as well. So sometimes people ask me, what is it to be an entrepreneur? And I usually said it requires not to be a VIP, but to be a VEP. You have to have vision, so you have to have a dream, you have to execute it very well, and then you have to have passion. So you have to believe in what you do. So this story started in Barcelona 15 years ago. So I am married to Julio, which is a brilliant physicist and mathematician, and we together founded Starlab. So we had the vision that there were a lot of problems in society, and we are in passion with science. So we did research, and we asked, can we make a company that can go all the way from research to the market to solve problems? And the conclusion, it has taken us 15 years. So I think it's very difficult to go from research to the market, but I can say now that we are very happy. We started in the Observatory Fabra. It's one of the most historic places in Barcelona. And I often say that in the US they start in garage, so we start in historic buildings, as we are today here. So that's an advantage of being here. So we started doing this research in neuroscience, so we wanted to really understand what's going on in the brain and in space. So to make the story short, we have learned a lot about the brain. So now that you're hopefully listening to me, the ones in the internet, I cannot see your brains, but your brain is sending electrical currents. So we have developed a technology that it's able to monitor and stimulate your brain. So I'm going to put it on so that we can talk a bit more about the features. So this is a wireless brain monitoring and brain stimulation device. So I can put it on right now. It's connected to the cloud, and it does two things. So it can monitor my brain signals in real time, for example, for the diagnostic of epilepsy, sleep disorders, maybe in the future neurodegenerative diseases as an early biomarker. But it can do another thing, which I think is really beautiful. It can inject currents into my brain. So by injecting small currents into the brain, I cannot even feel them. I can either excite or inhibit neuron activity, which means I can help patients recover from a stroke by exciting the motor area of the brain. I can help patients with depression. And in the future, our dream is, can we send a kid home, for example, with epilepsy, and be able to monitor a seizure and then prevent it from happening? So this is all technology made in Barcelona. So I am very proud of the scientists we have, and there are examples here in the room of the science we do in Barcelona, and I would say in Catalonia. I think that what we are missing is a bit that we can, and that business sense, that this can have a bigger of an impact. We need the transition from science to the business. So we created Neuroelectrics as a spin-off company of Starlab to really give that commercial push. So now Neuroelectrics is selling these devices. This is a medical device by the European Union. And we already sold in more than 35 countries. We have an office in Boston. And this is being used in some of the best hospitals and research centers in the world. So I am happy because I am starting to see that the vision we had 15 years ago in the Observatory Fabra, that we could do science, and this vision and take it to the market, it's beginning to happen. I will have to say that some of the lessons learned is that science is beautiful, but things take a lot of time. So to make breakthrough, to make technology, it takes a lot of time. But I think that if you really have a dream and you're perseverant and you go for it, at the end, you can really go to bed and think, well, I think I made something that didn't exist before that is actually helping people. So I hope that in the discussion, we can go a little bit more in depth on what it's to be from Barcelona working in this, for us, brain age.
Thank you, Anna. So would you like to come
Yes.
here? So we are missing a cup of tea in
It's
here.
okay.
It would be very nice. So put it in the back. So I would like, when you say, it is fascinating what you say it sounds like it was very easy. When you tell the story, it was 15 years ago we started, and now we are here, but all the way, how were those beginners? I mean, the beginnings, the money, the investment that you have to make, how many people started this project?
So, the beginning, on one side, was very hard, but on the other, it's very romantic. Because, when you start something, nobody, it's like jumping, from a mountain. You don't know, how you're going to fall. So there's no safety tent. But everything is to be done. So, it's blue sky. You can do anything. So I remember in the observatory we used to have, of course, no money, but we used to have these butanos, these heaters, and I remember working with half of my body totally warm and half totally frozen, And I remember having to rent a projector because we didn't have the money to buy a projector. So the beginning was hard, but on the other hand, you find the strength because you really have a dream.
But you had a very clear idea of what you want.
Yes.
And you also had a great training. I mean, your husband was already a PhD in physics and
in mathematics.
In mathematics. So your biggest asset was your education.
Yes, but our education, but I think that was the strength of the team. We started like 5 people, but Julio is a scientist and I am. Do you want me to
wait a minute, that we are having some problems with the audio, so we want people who are connected to hear you well, because it's very interesting. Gracias, Carlos.
Sorry, yes.
Ya está.
So we are educated, but we were not trained to be entrepreneurs. We were not trained to run a company. So I was an economist, but I had never, had a company before. So I think that it's a different learning skills, and you learn a lot by doing and by intuition and follow, your intuition. But I remember those times like the whole team was really passionate about what we wanted to do.
You think is something missing in the education in the universities right now? Because it happens same to me when musicians or medical doctors, they teach you how to do your work, but nobody teach you how to sell your product.
Yeah.
How to promote.
Yeah, I think that entrepreneurship should be done from a very, very early stage. Like in school at 6 years, we should tell kids, I give you $1 or €1, you have to come back with 3. What are you going to do to get 3? Make collaritos, sell whatever, This kind of business sense of managing a team, cause. I mean, there are a lot of things that we don't have in the culture so much or in the education system.
Very interesting. So now going back to you starting the observatory, what was the initial idea? Because you told me when we met that Julio had that idea. They said the future is in the space or in the brain. So he wanted to go in that direction. How was that?
So he had this vision, and I think he was completely right, that this century is going to be about space, and I think it's taking longer in space and neuroscience. And the thing is, how can you survive as a company until you develop the technologies that are needed on those fields? And I think we were lucky in Europe to have the European Commission support, which is amazing in terms of, getting grants to do R&D. We had some companies that back us in terms of giving us projects. And then we had the European Space Agency, which is the NASA of Europe. And we have been very competitive there as well in demonstrated we are very good at doing work for them.
When you started, you were 2, and now how many?
We are 40-something, I think.
And 40-something, how many of those 40-something are PhD full-time researchers?
Many of them, most of them.
So how was that you came here? Because normally our universities or educational institutions are the ones who host these high-end researchers. How did you manage to do that?
Well, I think that the beauty of Starlab and Neuroelectrics is, but specifically of Starlab, is a very scientific company, but it has a business culture. And these are 2 cultures which are very difficult to manage together because they come from very different ends. But I think that having Julio and myself in the company created the culture very naturally. So what I can bring to the table is that I'm not a scientist, but I am very aware of what's going on in the real world. So I bridge between the needs in hospitals and the science. So I think scientists have become more business people or customer-oriented in our company, and us, the commercial people, have become more scientists in the sense that we understand that things take time, and you cannot sell something that is going to. So I think that the beauty, and I always recommend entrepreneurs to mix teams. So if you put together a musician, a doctor and an architect, something pretty is going to come out because you're coming from such a different ends. And that's what happened a bit in our company.
This is beautiful because we are in the edge of interdisciplinarity. But when now talking about your cat or hat, or I don't know how you call it, I mean, it's interesting to see all the applications that you are finding. I mean, not only in medicine or for illnesses, but also in other areas like marketing. How is that? How did you arrive to?
Well, I think that it's an explosion of neuroscience and neurotechnology. I can see people using this for medical reasons, which is the main motivation after our company, but I can see people doing cognitive enhancement. Can we increase our memory? Can we prevent cognitive decline? Can we do better neuromarketing, neurofinancing? A lot of the things, I think they are not very well sustained in terms of science. And there is not scientific evidence, but it's more of a marketing thing. But there is really a lot of, we know very little about the brain, so it is normal that it's exploding because people are trying to understand what's going on the brain. And to be honest, we don't know. So there is a lot of research still to be done.
This is also exciting because it's like everything needs to be done.
Yes.
In a way, it's an open ground to discover. I was thinking right now, it came to my mind, in a Mozart opera. He talks about the mesmerica, it was something in the 18th century that were trying to put currents into the brain also. So this thing of putting electricity into the brain had been coming since 18th century, probably 19, in different ways.
No, even before.
Even before.
In the Romans, there is a very nice drawing in the Roman times where this emperor had a tremendous pain. And they used to bring a ray fish from the sea and place it over his head. And that is documented in books.
Oh.
So they were already using electricity in the Roman times for pain management.
Very interesting.
With a fish,
And now, probably at the end of the 20th century, we will have an idea of exactly what it does and in which areas of brain. Because now as I was looking at your company's site, we know that certain areas of the brain are stimulated, but we don't know what those areas do or how they affect certain behaviors or illnesses.
Yeah, I mean, we know, for example, that if you suffer from a stroke, we have to stimulate the motor cortex because you have a motor problem, right? But we don't know still in many pathologies what areas of the brain is better to stimulate. So for some pathologies, epilepsy is a very focal kind of neurological disease. Some of them are very well studied, but Alzheimer,
the entire brain.
Dementia, Parkinson's is in a deep area of the brain, but maybe through the outside we can get to deep structures if we are a bit creative on how we deliver electricity. Can you find pathways from outside to make you go deep in the brain? We don't know.
Wow. And it's a challenge, especially because it's all these computational connections that are also changing every minute.
Yeah, that's the beauty. I think that electroencephalography or the technologies we are working on, they are changing now because of the computational capacities we didn't have 30 years ago, and also because of the Bluetooth, the cloud. All this is allowing massive recording of medical data as well.
Now that you say Bluetooth, I saw on one of the videos in your site this experiment they did for the communication of the
brain to brain.
Brain to brain. Talk about that. That is so
there
cool.
Julia is talking on Saturday on a TED Talk talking about brain to brain. So we managed to publish for the first time two brains communicating to each other without any sensory information.
And one was in one country and the other France and
India.
And India, my goodness.
So the person in India had one of these devices that was collecting his brain signals, right? So he was thinking in a particular way. For example, if I think I move my feet, the brain makes a signal like this. and that means one. We code it as a one.
Binary thing.
Yes. The person in France was receiving stimulation on the cerebral cortex. So depending on the stimulation, he was seeing lights or not, phosphene, so kind of twinkling lights, because your cerebral cortex is stimulated. So we coded this, and the guy in India was able to transmit by 1 and 0s, hola and ciao, in a particular coding mode, to the person in France. So he was understanding that he was saying hola and ciao only with these brain signals.
This is really amazing, because it's also the dream of, since probably mankind, just brain-to-brain communication or understanding, or this is amazing. Sounds like science fiction.
Yeah, but I haven't. People, when they think brain-to-brain, they think, I want to read what you're thinking, right? But what I describe is not the same,
no.
Right? I control a signal, and then you're receiving a message.
The exact message that I want you to receive.
So it's not reading minds, which I think is what you would like to do.
Yes. Well, this is so exciting. And last questions, so from somebody here, it says, how to innovate in this changing and challenging context of science and technology? Wow.
Well, I think the execution is very important. And oftentimes people, they think that ideas are good enough, and then you have to deliver. So at the end, it's up to developing great products, great services, great technology. Whatever you do has to be really good. And then you have to be able to push it and sell it to wherever the community is, convince the key opinion leaders. So I think there is always room for innovation, but you just have to execute and make sure that you go around and explain why what you have developed is so good.
So innovation has to be hand-to-hand with communication. That's what you're saying. That would be kind of marketing.
But without a good product, there is no communication, right? Because the scientific community, it's very smart, right?
Yes.
But so you cannot fool people. So I think that first you have to scientifically and technically do good products, good technology, good. Even if you do an app, do it well, and then you're ready to go out there and sell and promote and travel the world.
Thank you very much, Anna. It has been very, very nice to talk to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, and we will see each other at the end. And now we continue with this very exciting journey through time, because we have gone from all the way from medievals to the 21st century, and now we come back or go back in time to the 18th century to talk about the English language and how was the English language in the 18th century in Catalunya and Spain also, and in Barcelona. And our guest is a Catalan born in Canada, who came here many years ago and is a researcher and a university teacher specialized in the English language in the 18th century. Welcome, John Stone.
Well, good evening, and Patricia, thank you very much for having me. I do a kind of research into cultural history, and what I look at, I call extraterritorial reading. I made up that phrase, so I'll have to sort of tell you what it means. And to tell you what it means, I want to talk a little bit about Jane Austen, because I know you'll all be familiar with her. And then I want to talk a little bit about Stilton cheese, because I expect some of you will have tried Stilton cheese. I know it doesn't sound like it's going to be about books, but really it is. And then finally, I want to talk about a Scottish college that wasn't in Scotland. So I'll start with Jane Austen. It's the year 2015. How many of you have read a Jane Austen book? Right, so hands up. That's, not everybody, but almost everybody. Okay. How many of you have read a Jane Austen book in English, if English is not your mother tongue? Have you tried to read Jane Austen in English? So we've got a few hands going up. Okay. So if we jump back in time 200 years, if we go back to 1815, it's significant because she's published almost all of her great novels. There's only one that had yet to be published. How likely would it be to find someone in Barcelona who had read a Jane Austen book? Not very likely, right? How likely would it be to find anyone in Barcelona who could read a book in English of any kind? A scientific book, or a journal of some kind with political news, right? So that's what I mean by extraterritorial reading. Every language has territory that it's associated with, where it's a language of community use, of culture, and of socialization for children. What happens when you step out of that territory? So what happens if you go to Singapore and you walk into someone's flat, and I've been left without my prop, and you walk up to a wall of books because they've got a lovely flat and they've got all kinds of books, and you see that in the wall of books there's a row that's entirely in Catalan. Oh, what are you doing with all these books in Catalan? Or you walk into a flat in Barcelona and you find that there's a row of books in Chinese, in one Chinese, because there's more than one Chinese, only one writing system, but more than one language. How can you explain the presence of a literacy that's really uncommon in a place where you wouldn't expect to find it? Now, it's not that far-fetched to say that reading in English in Barcelona or in Spain 200 years ago, 250 years ago, is something like reading Catalan in Singapore today. And I'm sure there are Catalans in Singapore, and I'm sure they have some Catalan books. So their friends walk in and see the Catalan books, can pull them off the shelf, but how many people can read them, right? Mm-hmm. How extraordinary was it? Who were the readers? What did it mean for the readers? And also, what did it mean for the state, right? There was more than one kind of reader of English in a city like Barcelona 200 years ago. Right? One kind of reader would be someone who brought the language with them. So there's a small community of Anglophones in the city then. There was a somewhat larger community of Francophones in the city. Right? French was the lingua franca, had been all the way through the 18th century. So educated people, cosmopolitan people, accidental cosmopolitans even, like me. I didn't expect to be speaking Catalan and Spanish as an adult. Those people will be expected to know French. They won't be expected to know English. So if they pick up English, why are they going to pick it up? Well, there was a Catalan surgeon by the name of Gimbernat, and he went to England to do some of his training, and he did some training with an anatomist named John Hunter. We all have a bit of anatomy inside of us that's named after Gimbernat. And Gimbernat learned English and subscribed to journals that were coming from Edinburgh, because Edinburgh was the capital of medical education in English. He was doing that for professional purposes. So you find in major cities, especially in coastal cities, you find little pools of people who, either through trade or often through science, have this early knowledge of English. Right? People who have brought the language with them, who do they tend to be? They can be Irish exiles all the way through the 18th century, because Ireland is a Catholic country under a sort of apartheid regime, where if you're Catholic and you come from an elite background, it's not a good place to be, you might want to leave. And so where do you go? Well, you go to Catholic countries that will accept you, give you sort of rubber stamp and say, okay, walk into our state administration, walk into the military, we'll give you good jobs, all you have to do is change your name around a little bit so that we can pronounce it. I can't give you anecdotes, but marvelous things happen to people with names like McConaughey and Walsh, as those names are Hispanicized. I should be able to remember Walsh. It might come back to me later. Right? I study, in particular, a group of Scottish merchants. It's a network. It's based in Barcelona. It spreads all over Spain. They come here originally to trade in wine. They later trade in fruit. Later they trade in finance, if you can say that. The man who was at the center of this network, his name was Harris. He was an international banker. He had 3 headquarters. One was London, one was Paris, one was Barcelona. He came here and he trained first in Amsterdam, then he came here, lived here for 10 years. He invented the traveler's check, which anyone over 40 will remember. Those of you who are younger than 40, you might not remember traveler's checks. Right? It's before we had electronic money, and people used traveler's checks for 200 years. You could almost say that's a Catalan invention. Right? The third group that I'm interested in is censors. Right? That's to say, the state intervenes and comes along and says, you can't read this book. But what happens if the book is in a language that the state apparatus or the ecclesiastical censors are not familiar with? And would they have been familiar with English? So if the books come in, and how do they come in? They're often coming in diplomatic coaches, and they're underneath Stilton cheese. So you go to the diplomats, you go to the ambassador and say, I want this book, I want that book from London. The ambassador, as a favor, will bring it for you, right?
So come here and we continue talking here. Yes,
yeah?
wow,
Okay.
way back.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yes, I want my tea
Yeah?
here with you.
Okay.
So John, what it fascinates me about this,
Yes.
what you are saying is that you are just showing us a window
Yes.
to this world of how was Barcelona and Catalunya at that time.
And other cities,
So
frankly.
how was
I didn't get to
mean,
my Scottish college that wasn't in Spain. But
well,
I
no,
can
but we
say
will
that.
go there.
Yeah.
So tell me, why these English speakers came to Catalonia
They came here to make money.
to make money? So,
Most of them, okay, if they were Scottish, they came here to make money because they were merchants and they were working in finance.
so this was a place to make money.
One of the founders of Barcelona's first modern bank in the 1770s was Scottish. One was French. And they were here because they could trade with the Americas. They were here because they were working trade networks that took them from the Mediterranean to the British Isles and then to the Americas, where the part of the Americas controlled by Great Britain or by Spain. And as the needs of the population changed, they were importing different things, exporting different things.
What kind of things?
Right? Well, if there was a bad harvest here, they'd be importing wheat from what's now the United States. They were regularly exporting wine, and it was taken either to the Isle of Man, which is between Great Britain and Ireland, or to the Channel Islands, where it would be re-exported in small boats. So essentially, they all begin as smugglers.
Mm-hmm.
The trade is somewhat illicit. But what's interesting is that the books follow them. In their correspondence, you have people back in Edinburgh saying, okay, do you need any books? Are you bored? You need something to read? And the people I study in the community here in Barcelona will say, well, all the foreigners here share their books. We've got enough books in English and French, and no one seems to bother us.
So you said at the time there was also a censorship for what you can read,
Yes.
which books can enter the
Yeah.
kind of...
There's state censorship for publication, so if you want to publish something in Spanish or in Catalan, which was far more unusual, you have to go to the state and ask for a license, right? When you bring books into the country, you're supposed to show them to an ecclesiastical control, so that's a church control, that's going to decide whether the book is admitted or not. If the book is in French, if the book is in Italian, then the censors will be able to read those languages, and they'll be able to recognize names and say, no, you can't have this. But if the books are in English, 9 times out of 10, either the censor just says, sorry, I don't understand that, or there's a little bit of confusion and then you provide a little bribe. It's easy
And
enough
the
to
books
document
just
that.
enter.
And the books come in. Or you send them by ship and you smuggle them off the ship. People of that period wore what were called great coats, which had lots of pockets on the inside. Small books, you just pop them into the pockets. And in the last case that I've been studying, I found a Scottish college that was re-established in a small Castilian city around 1770. And for about a 40-year period, they built up a library that would have been at home in a country house in Scotland. They were getting periodicals. They had over 100 volumes of poetry. They had very little fiction, which is quite sad, but they must have had between 300 or 400 books in English with a strong Scottish emphasis. So it wasn't just a library in English, it was a library in English to represent Scottish intellectual life in the middle of the Scottish Enlightenment. You know, all the big thinkers thinking in the English language in the second half of the 18th century, they're almost all Scottish, right? And in the sciences as well. And I know that by the year 1790, they had people in that city coming to them to learn English.
Wow. And where exactly what this family, where were there?
No, this Scottish college is not a family thing, it's a church thing.
It's a church thing.
That's the strange thing. The church gives a community of Scottish priests and students a former Jesuit college in Valladolid, in Castile, And they say, okay, you're supposed to train priests who are going to go back to Scotland, which is full of Calvinists, and convert everyone back to Catholicism. And they expect this community of Scots to be unplugged from Scottish intellectual life. But exactly the opposite is true. They're getting and they're reading everything. They're getting Adam Smith, they have David Hume. David Hume was an atheist, he was a notorious atheist.
And who, for example, I imagined physicians also were speaking, I mean, here, or here, surgeons.
The people who knew English would tend to have Irish heritage. If they had Irish heritage, then they'd sort of develop a hybrid culture over several generations. They would keep their English, but they would become Spanish subjects, and very often they would apply to the crown to be recognized as hidalgos, because once they were hidalgos, they could go into state administration, colonial administration, go into the military, etc. Right? But they would keep up their English because it was their bread and butter. They were
like
normally working in commerce, and what's the advantage that they've got over their competitors? Their advantage is that they can deal with English-speaking markets in what's now the United States, in Great Britain and Ireland. Right? The other people who learn English, that's to say native-born Catalans who learn English, tend to be scientific, occasionally they're military, and then there's some mysterious individuals who may or may not have been of Irish heritage, were working in church institutions and ended up with a book of Shakespeare criticism. Like I found a book of Shakespeare criticism owned by a library in Manresa in the 1760s. I don't know who brought it there. I don't know who was reading it, but it's in English.
Yeah.
If you look at the surviving editions of Shakespeare in Spanish libraries from the period, you would expect them to be French translations, because there are plenty of French translations of Shakespeare. That's la lingua franca, cultured people know it. No, the Shakespeare that you find is almost entirely in English.
Wow, very interesting.
And it's a status object too. Some nobles who want to show that they're cosmopolitan will go out of their way to get Shakespeare editions in English, put them on the shelf.
Just as a decoration.
We don't know if they read them or not, or if they were just a decoration. It's like, oh, they really make the room.
And what happened with those families of traders and merchants who were living the Scots and here?
Well, if they wanted to stay, they had to convert to Catholicism if they were not already Catholic. Now, some of the families that I study have connections to the northeast of Scotland, where there was a Catholic minority and a lot of clandestine Catholics. So some of those people might have just said, okay, I'll stay here and be Catholic. I was always Catholic anyway. Right? But some people decide that because their business is going very well, they are going to convert to Catholicism, change their name. One of the early Shakespeare translators into Castilian, not into Catalan, Catalan comes much later, is a man named Macpherson, Guillermo Macpherson, and his father was either a Douglas or a Duncan Macpherson. He was a Scottish merchant. He decided to convert. He stayed, so his son grew up speaking English and Spanish, and then 40 years later you get a Shakespeare translator. You don't get any direct translation of literature from English into Spanish until 1798 for a full-length book.
So, and now I'm remembering that slave who came, the autobiography of slaves.
Yes.
Tell us that story, very interesting.
Yeah, well, this is a Nigerian who was probably born in the 1740s, and he was kidnapped from his kingdom. He said his father was a local king, and taken to the coast, sold on, sold again, finally sold to traders, taken to the West Indies, and passed through the hands of 3 or 4 masters in the West Indies. He was bright, he taught himself to read and write very quickly, he taught himself accounting, so he became a sort of administrative slave rather than someone working in the fields.
And he came to Barcelona.
Yes, then he was bought by a captain in the Royal Navy, or a lieutenant rather, and he became sort of a house slave on a Royal Navy ship. The biggest Royal Navy ships could be like small towns, 800 people on a ship.
Wow.
Or what was called a ship of the line, absolutely massive. This is in the late 1750s, and Spain was still neutral in a war between France and Britain. Right? So they had been in the part of Canada where my parents are from, at the siege of an important fortress, and then 8 months later, the same ship, the same people, including the slave, Ulada Equiano is his name, they come into Barcelona, And he has a wonderful time, and he says that the people here are very nice.
And how we know that he said that?
It's in his autobiography.
Oh, he wrote an autobiography.
He wrote an autobiography, which is it's a polemic about slavery, and it's part of a movement in the 1790s to have slavery abolished. And the slave trade was abolished in 1807. So people had been working towards that for about 20, 30 years, really. And he was, part of a group of political activists. Like Obama was a professional political activist before he went into electoral politics. This man, who had been a slave, became a professional lecturer. He went around to different towns in Great Britain and Ireland, giving talks on slavery to help persuade people. And the book that he used to convince people was his autobiography, and it talks about his visit to Barcelona as an early teen.
Wow, this is really amazing. And now I'm thinking, how we go from there, that the English being like a language that was secondary or
Completely
tertiary,
marginal.
completely marginal, until now. So when Catalans or people in Catalonia start to actively studying or having present language as an important language?
Well, this is anecdotal for me. If I look at the history of translation, there are people translating from English into Catalan in a big way by the 1920s. And there's a small urban population for whom English is the second foreign language. These are consistently people who learn French and then they move on to English, or other people will learn French and then move on to German. But it's a tiny, tiny, tiny group. The shift in the Catalan education system really comes in the 1980s. Until then...
It's very, very recent.
Very recently. Until then, you went to secondary school and it was expected that you would study French. And beginning at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, the shift had gone over to English. English was the predominant foreign language in Catalan education. So it's
very new.
It's in the lifetime of almost everyone I know.
Yes, it's very new. Oh, that's very interesting, and I think we can continue talking about language and the use of language with our previous guest. What do you think?
Sure.
Thank you very much for your participation, and now we invite Alexander and Anna. So one of the leitmotif in this whole conversation have been, I think, language or communication. As Ramon mateix wanted to persuade with language, and language was a key element in his communication. What do you think, Alexander?
I think with you it's clear. Language is about reaching the audience and the public that you target, and that's what you did. I mean, what I was thinking when listening to you in particular right now, it's kind of a bit different case, but what I have always observed on the Catalan publishing scene is a considerable lack of bilingual editions. Speaking about translations and use of language, if I think of other countries and their publishing traditions and academic traditions, you would have all these important series, be they philosophical or whatsoever, where you can read Locke and Hume in a bilingual translation or edition, or you can read Descartes and Leibniz in French and German at the same time. And I think that this is, speaking about more current developments, that this may be a problem, that languages are getting lost. We're focusing very much on 2, maybe 3 languages, Catalan, English, Spanish, but in some way, at least a passive command of other languages is not really fostered, I think.
And I think it's very interesting that your website and your research and your work environment is in English mainly. We are actually doing this program in English. We're in Catalunya. So this is like the lingua franca of the 18th century, like French.
Oh, entirely. Yeah, it's curious, but I've been told that ambitious students in Spanish studies in my own university are told that they need a good reading knowledge of English. Even though they're studying Spanish literature, enough of the criticism of what they're reading is published in English that without that reading knowledge, their expertise is incomplete.
¿Qué piensas, Ana?
Yeah, I think I actually always say that in Catalonia we are missing a more English and technology culture. And I often say that we shouldn't, in the Spanish and Catalan television, change any original film.
Sí.
That would be a very small measure that will have a tremendous impact on the next generations. I do believe that in my field in technology, the language is English. And I think that the great scientists we have in Barcelona, they shouldn't have any barriers. And what English allows you today is to go and promote what you're doing anywhere in the world. So that's why I think that English has become so important in order to not set you any limits on what you can do.
At the same time, I'm thinking in Ramon Llull, in the effort he did to learn the Arabic or to just, because you only can enter into another culture, just the key is language to understand all the mentality, the culture.
I mean, as I think I already did, I would rather advocate different language options at the same time. Maybe in business and maybe in science, English seems to be the highway to success. In the humanities, I'm much more reluctant. Why should I write on a Catalan medieval poem in English? And would I be able to express myself? First of all, I would have to translate it into English. And then I would have to comment on that text, which I translated into English, putting into brackets the original words, which makes little sense. And also, I think there is the kind of danger that we, particularly those of us who are not native English speakers, that we think that with that kind of English that we use in academia, we are actually speaking English. I think there is a European administrative and science English, which is by no means, I would say, the fully developed language that English stands for. But I mean, I'm not a native speaker, so I have to leave that judgment to you.
I think it's pretty good. But the European Commission's policy is that everyone should have their mother tongue +2. So for Catalans, who consider themselves native bilinguals, that would be your mother tongues +2, that adds up to 4. Unfortunately, the opportunities for children and for teens to pursue that and to start studying yet another foreign language are rather limited. And for younger children, it's nearly impossible to find a school where a 10-year-old child will be studying 2 foreign languages at the same time.
Also for brain plasticity.
Yeah.
I was thinking, is if you start from very early age to learn different languages, it creates more connections and things.
Yeah, but I agree with him that languages are not very well spoken today in general. For example, when you hear a Catalan speaking well Catalan, you really say like, wow, how well he speaks. Or when you see an English, cultivated person speaking English. You really acknowledge. So that brings you to the point that there is not so much people speaking properly.
Even in the native speakers.
No,
because
I'm talking about native.
Yeah, because average language is many times is very poor, the use of the language.
So people should read more poetry, people should read more books, more. I think that it's a matter of, even in your own language, cultivating yourself to speak properly.
It's the decline of something called print culture. And print culture is when the written word becomes the primary means and artifact of cultural transmission. So it, more than orality, more than people learning stories from their grandparents, from their neighbors who tell them the stories, you listen to the stories. Starting around the middle of the 18th century, in many cultures, in Germany and England, the book and the printed word became the primary artifact. Now the cultural history of that experience here is shorter, and for the Catalan language it's very short, because when does Catalan become a language of the press and of a thriving publishing scene? Between 1890 and 1936, and then that whole development is truncated. Right? It's often said that Catalan doesn't have an 18th century, so I'm an 18th century specialist, and I can go back and read Spanish prose works from the 18th century, which Cadalso, which I thoroughly enjoy. But in Catalan, I have to sort of root around to find anything that was written at that time. Typically, it's manuscript material that was edited much later on. That print culture continues until when we were young, and then electronic culture comes and starts to push it out, right? So young people today, whether or not they're native speakers, will have far less of a focus on the printed word than we did classically. And from what I've heard, it does things to the brain. The obsessive focus on print does things to the way you think, but also does things to cognition. It orders things more. You know, a book is an ordered artifact when it develops a table of contents at the front and an index at the back. It's a system for finding things, right? And it's black and white. What did McLuhan call it? He called it a cool medium, I think, right?
But I think probably now we will be developing a new connections, and there are new ways, probably more, where the predominance of images, colors, videos, audios. So it's different, not better, not worse, but it's a loss.
It's a loss.
The richness of the.
Rich speech comes from a lot of reading or from rhetorical training.
Yeah.
We don't give those to children anymore.
Yes, yeah. It's a danger.
I think it's a loss when you listen to someone that speaks well, you think, wow, that is a loss that nobody speaks anymore like that.
We need to read more. And what you say, poetry.
Poetry is,
See, this is true. We could be speaking here for a very long time, I think, because there are many, many connections in here, but I think our time is about to expire. I'm very, very grateful for your presence here, for you are inspiring people, and I'm sure people who are on the other side of people who are here, and people who are on the other side of the internet, in different countries, they are inspired by what you say. Moltes gràcies per la vostra participació d'aquesta nit. Us esperem el pròxim 21 de juliol, el tercer dimarts de cada mes a EYECatalunya. Moltes gràcies per la vostra presència, per la vostra participació i fins aviat des de Barcelona. Adeu. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.